The iron rim of the wooden stagecoach wheel bound against a jagged stone, sending a violent jolt through the cabin that nearly threw Eleanor Vance from her seat. Outside, the Fresno sun beat down like molten iron, scorching the dry dust into blinding yellow clouds. Heat shimmers danced across the barren dirt road, blurring the wooden storefronts of Willow Creek into distorted phantoms. Inside the swaying coach, Eleanor clutched her worn velvet carpetbag to her chest, her knuckles turning bone white. Her lungs burned with every breath of baked valley air, but it was not the suffocating heat that made her heart hammer against her ribs. It was the realization that if the man waiting at the end of this road turned her away, she would have nowhere left on this earth to go. The coach groaned to a heavy halt in front of the town mercantile. Dust settled slowly over the warped timber boardwalk sticking to the damp hem of Eleanor's dark blue traveling dress. Through the glass window she watched the town. It was a place forged out of drought and desperation, a sun-bleached outpost in California's Fresno Valley where water was traded like gold and mercy was in short supply. The omniscient eye of time, had it paused, there would have seen the quiet tragedy written into Eleanor Vance's posture. She was 26, built with soft, heavy curves that the fashionable dressmakers in San Francisco had always tried to hide beneath layers of dark, stiff fabric. Her parents' wealthy shipping merchants, whose homes smelled of imported tea and polished mahogany, had long viewed Eleanor's stout frame as a silent disappointment. They praised her sharp mind for ledger books in private, but in public, they hurried her past eligible bachelors. When the chance arose to send her 1,200 miles south with a modest dowry to wed Thomas Bennett, a man her father claimed was a prosperous valley rancher, her family had packed her bags with polite relief. They had handed her a folded marriage proposal and erased her from their ledger. Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against her ribs, feeling the rigid edges of that folded paper. It was her only shield against the world. When the stagecoach driver set the wooden iron-bound footstool on the dirt, the silence of Willow Creek fractured. A sharp, careless laugh erupted from the shade of the mercantile porch. A group of local day laborers and cattle hands leaned against the hitching rail, turning to stare as Eleanor carefully stepped down. "Looks like they packed you two wives in one dress," Bennett, a man in a grease-stained hat, called out. Laughter rippled across the dusty street. It was sharp, cruel, and familiar, the exact tone Eleanor had spent her entire youth enduring in ballroom corners. But her chin did not drop. Her father had taught her that weakness invited predators. Her own pride demanded she stand firm. Beside an old wooden buckboard wagon stood Thomas Bennett. He did not look like a prosperous rancher. He was built lean and hard, his broad shoulders contoured by years of brutal manual labor under the California sun. His chambray shirt was faded to the color of ash, mended at the elbows with coarse thread, and his jaw carried 3 days of dark stubble. His gray eyes were shadowed by the brim of a dust-covered Stetson eyes that looked as though a long, bitter winter had settled behind them and refused to clear. When Thomas looked at Eleanor, his gaze did not stop at her face. It swept over her heavy traveling coat, her broad frame, and her silver-trimmed carpetbag. Then slowly he turned his back on her. "There's been a mistake," Thomas said quietly to the station agent. The street went dead silent. The coach horses stamped impatiently in the heat, their iron shoes clicking against the hard-packed earth. Eleanor remained on the bottom step for one long, agonizing heartbeat. 4 days she had spent traveling in cramped cabins, eating hard biscuits and holding a forged promise in her mind. She had sold her mother's silver hairbrush and left behind the only life she knew, all for a man who could not even look her in the eye. Mr. Bennett. Her voice cut across the hot wind, clear poised and striking him square between the shoulder blades. Thomas paused, but he didn't turn. "Elias Thomas Bennett," she repeated, stepping squarely into the dusty thoroughfare. "If you mean to reject me, you will do it while looking at my face. I did not travel from San Francisco to be dismissed by the back of a coat." The men at the hitching rail stopped grinning. The sheer authority in her tone commanded the space between them. Slowly, Thomas turned around. His leather gloves were tucked into his belt, his hands resting heavily on his hips. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice gravelly from dry air and long hours, "I don't know what your father told you in San Francisco, but I didn't send for a bride, and I certainly didn't send for a lady of your standing." "You signed this," Eleanor said, drawing the folded letter from her glove and holding it out. "You wrote that you owned 300 acres in Fresno County. You said you needed a woman who could keep a house, cook a meal, and face the dry seasons without running." Thomas's eyes flicked to the paper, but his hands remained at his side. "The hand looks like mine, but I never sent it. I asked a traveling landbroker last spring if he knew of a middle-aged housekeeper willing to work for room and board. I never paid anyone's passage, and I never asked for a wife. Cold dread settled in Eleanor's stomach, heavy and dark. I sold my home, Mr. Bennett. I have no brothers, no estate, and no ticket back. What I own is in this carpet bag. I can give you $5 for a night at the boarding house, Thomas offered, his tone softening with reluctant pity. Tomorrow the northbound stage can take you back to the Valley Junction. With what money? Eleanor challenged quietly. Thomas flinched. The pride of a poor man is a fragile thing, and Eleanor had just laid her finger on its rawest nerve. He looked down at his worn leather boots, unable to answer. From behind his wagon, a small voice broke the tension. Eleanor looked past Thomas's tall frame toward the patched canvas cover of the buckboard. 6 boys sat lined up like stair-steps in the shadow of the wagon bed. The eldest looked about 17 with his father's sharp jaw and guarded gray eyes. The youngest was barely 5, his tiny head barely clearing the wooden side. Every one of them was painfully thin. Their hair was overgrown, their shirts patched with mismatched cloth, and their eyes held the hollow, watchful stillness of children who had learned that wanting things only brought disappointment. The youngest boy whimpered softly, pressing himself deeper into the shade. He was holding his right arm behind his back. Eleanor forgot the cruel men at the mercantile. She forgot the burning heat and the sting of Thomas's rejection. Her sharp eyes had caught the gray, dirty rag wrapped around the child's small forearm. She stepped past Thomas before he could stop her. What happened to his hand? The eldest boy. Caleb stood up defensively in the wagon bed. He touched the stovepot last night, trying to pull the beans off before they burned. "May I see it, sweet child?" Eleanor asked softly, keeping her distance so as not to startle him. The 5-year-old looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. Slowly, he brought his arm forward. The dirty cloth had loosened, exposing raw, inflamed skin underneath that was dangerously close to infection. "That needs to be cleaned and dressed with salve immediately." Eleanor said, her tone instantly shifting from defensive bride to practical authority. "I cleaned it with well water," Caleb said defensively, though his young voice trembled with guilt. "We didn't have clean rags left. You did what you could," Eleanor assured him gently. "A boy who stands near a hot stove to feed his brothers is a brave boy, but brave boys still need help." A woman carrying a basket of dried sage and wild chamomile stepped off the mercantile porch. It was Aunt Hattie, the local healer, her face lined by decades of California sun. She glanced at Eleanor, then at Thomas, before handing a small glass jar of yellow ointment and a roll of white linen to Eleanor. "Yarrow and lard," Hattie murmured softly. "Clean water first, child. Hungry children reach for warmth before they know if it burns." Eleanor accepted the medicine, her mind working with the swift precision she had inherited from her merchant ancestors. She looked back at Thomas Bennett, whose face was a mask of exhausted defeat. "I will make you a bargain, Mr. Bennett," Eleanor said, her voice steady enough for the entire street to hear. "I will ride to your ranch. I will clean this child's burn properly and cook your family one complete meal. I will sleep under your roof tonight, and tomorrow morning, if you still believe I have no place here, we will decide what comes next." Thomas stared at her, his gray eyes searching her resolute face. "I have nothing to offer, Lady Miss Vance. My well is nearly dry. My land is hard rock. I cannot offer you comfort." "I did not ask for comfort," Eleanor replied, lifting her heavy carpet bag with one firm hand. "I asked for a fair trial." Thomas looked at little Henry, who was leaning toward Eleanor's gentle warmth. He looked at Caleb, whose guarded expression had flickered with a faint, desperate hope. At last, Thomas bent down, picked up Eleanor's heavy trunk, and tossed it into the back of the wagon. "Get in," he said gruffly. "We need to buy flour before the sun sets." As the buckboard creaked out of town, toward the dust-choked northern pasture, Eleanor sat among 6 silent, watchful boys. She did not know that behind them in the shadows of the town office, a wealthy land speculator named Lester Finch was watching her arrival with calculating eyes, or that the dry, rock-strewn dirt of the Bennett ranch hid a secret powerful enough to tear this fragile family apart. The iron wheels of the buckboard wagon groaned under the weight of the supply sacks as they turned onto the narrow trail leading north. The dust here was thicker, fine as pale flour kicked up by the horses until it hung in the hot air like a shroud. Sitting on a wooden crate behind Thomas Bennett, Eleanor Vance held little Henry's uninjured arm gently in her lap. The boy had finally stopped trembling, though his large dark eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's face, as if he expected her to vanish into the heat shimmer at any moment. Beside her, The other 5 Bennett boys sat in guarded silence. Caleb kept his eyes trained on the dusty horizon, his long jaw clamped tight. Noah and Ethan, the middle brothers, nudged each other whenever the wagon hit a deep rut, silently passing the remaining crust of dried salt pork between them. Little Lucas and Mason huddled together beneath the shade of Eleanor's broad wool coat, which she had draped over a wooden barrel to block the punishing afternoon sun. When the wagon pulled into the yard of the Bennett homestead, the full reality of Thomas's plight revealed itself. The house was a modest 2-room structure built from sun-bleached redwood, its porch roof sagging slightly to the left where a main support post had cracked. Beyond the house lay 300 acres of cracked iron-red earth strewn with gray boulders and scrubby mesquite bushes that withered under the relentless Fresno heat. A dry wooden windmill stood like a skeletal sentinel over a shallow well, its metal blades motionless in the still air. Thomas hopped down from the seat, his boots striking the dry ground with a muffled thud. He didn't offer Eleanor his hand, but he paused long enough to grab her heavy trunk from the back, setting it on the porch planks with a dull thud. "It isn't much," Thomas said, his voice flat, stripped of pride. "The well is down to 2 buckets a morning. The kitchen is through that door." Eleanor stepped down, her knees stiff from the long ride. She smoothed the front of her skirt and looked at the weathered house. She knew what a man looked like when defeat had settled into his bones. Her own uncle had looked the same way when his shipping line went under. But as her gaze moved across the yard, her sharp, trained eyes, accustomed to analyzing land maps and trade ledgers in her father's library, noticed something peculiar. Along the northern rise of the dry pasture, a line of wild green mesquite trees grew far thicker and greener than the scorched brush near the house. Scattered among the red dirt were pale outcroppings of soft, porous limestone. In the books she had read on California geology, such formations often pointed to deep, hidden subterranean channels where mountain runoff sank beneath the valley floor. She kept the thought to herself for now. A woman claiming to know the secrets of the earth before she had even baked a loaf of bread would only invite more scorn. Inside the cabin smelled of old ash, dry pine, and long-standing dust. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by 2 rough-hewn pine tables. On the mantelpiece rested a small brass picture frame placed face down in the dust. Eleanor recognized the silence in the room. It was the quiet of a house where people survived together but no longer lived together. "Caleb, fetch the water bucket," Eleanor instructed calmly, taking off her traveling gloves and rolling up her sleeves. "Noah, sweep the hearth. Ethan and Lucas, clear those wooden chairs along the wall and bring them to the center table." Caleb paused near the doorway, his gray eyes flashing. "We don't usually sit at the table together. Pa eats on the porch and we take our bowls to the yard." Eleanor picked up a wooden spoon from the cold stove and met his gaze with steady warmth. "A house does not become a home when the roof goes up, Caleb. It becomes a home when someone notices who has been standing outside the circle and pulls up another chair. Today, we sit together." Caleb stared at her for a long second, his defiance crumbling beneath her calm authority. He grabbed the tin bucket and headed for the well. Within an hour, the quiet cabin transformed. Eleanor opened her carpet bag, pulling out jars of dried thyme salt sugar and smoked salt pork she had brought from the San Francisco markets. She kindled a soft fire in the iron stove, sliced the remaining potatoes, and set a heavy iron skillet to simmer. The rich, savory aroma of fried pork, warm potatoes, and fresh skillet bread soon drifted out through the open windows, cutting through the dry smell of dust. When Thomas entered the cabin, wash basin in hand, he stopped dead in his tracks. 6 boys sat clustered around the main table, their thin faces illuminated by the warm glow of an oil lamp Eleanor had cleaned. Even little Henry was sitting up, his burned arm freshly washed with Hattie's yarrow salve and bound in clean white linen. At the center of the table stood a steaming skillet of food, flanked by a pitcher of cool water and a plate of golden bread. For a moment, Thomas looked like a man who had walked into a dream he wasn't allowed to keep. He slowly pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. When he reached for his fork, his hand trembled slightly. They ate in reverent silence, at first the boys devouring the warm food with a quiet intensity that made Eleanor's heart ache. For the first time in 3 years, soft laughter rippled across the table as little Mason accidentally dropped a potato into Henry's cup. Late that night, after the 6 boys had crawled into their straw pallets in the loft and Thomas had retired to his small room off the kitchen, Eleanor sat by the dying embers of the hearth. The house was quiet save for the dry wind rattling the wooden shutters. A soft scraping sound drew her attention toward the wood stove. Eleanor stood up quietly and stepped into the dim kitchen shadow. Young Caleb was crouched beside the stove, a small stub of a candle flickering beside him. In his right hand he held the folded marriage proposal letter. He was lowering the edge of the paper toward the yellow flame. Caleb, Eleanor whispered softly. The boy jumped, dropping the paper. He scrambled back against the woodpile, his face pale in the candlelight, his eyes filled with sudden terror. Eleanor knelt beside him, sweeping her skirt out of the way and gently pinched out the ember on the edge of the paper. She looked at the handwriting, the stiff formal slants that she had studied during her long stagecoach ride from Missouri and California. Up close under the candlelight she saw the subtle tremor in the ink strokes. It was not the handwriting of a grown man who labored with heavy iron and cattle. It was the careful, practiced hand of a 17-year-old boy trying to mimic his father's signature. "Your father never wrote this," Eleanor said quietly, looking into Caleb's wide eyes. "You did." Caleb buried his face in his knees, his shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. Pa didn't know, he choked out, his voice raw. "I found an old contract he signed before Ma left. I practiced his name every night for 2 weeks. I sold my winter boots to pay the broker in town to post the notice." He lifted his tear-streaked face, looking at her with a desperate, adult grief that no teenager should ever bear. "Samuel burned his hand because I was out mending the fence. Jonah stopped talking last winter. The storekeeper said he wouldn't extend our credit past harvest. I thought if winter came and nothing changed one morning, I'd wake up and one of my brothers would be gone." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out and placed her warm hand over his trembling shoulder. "A wrong choice born out of love does not mean you have a dark heart, Caleb. It means you were carrying a burden that was too heavy for one pair of shoulders." "If Pa finds out, he'll send you away," Caleb whispered, "and he'll never forgive me." "I will not find out tonight," Eleanor assured him, gently folding the paper and placing it inside her bodice. "And when he does know the truth, we will face it together." Before Caleb could answer, the sharp sound of galloping iron horseshoes echoed from the dusty trail outside. The heavy thud of a horse stopping abruptly in the yard shook the quiet night, followed by 3 loud, deliberate raps of an iron crop against the porch post. Eleanor stood up, her jaw setting firm. She stepped toward the front door just as Thomas emerged from his room, his hand gripping an old hunting rifle. Through the wooden doorframe, a harsh, haughty voice called out into the dark California night, a voice that carried the smooth, lethal authority of a man who owned men's lives. "Bennett," the voice shouted, "you've got 30 days to clear your back taxes with the Fresno Land Office, or Harlan Voss takes the North Meadow." Thomas swung the heavy pine door open, his thumb pulling back the hammer of the rifle with a sharp metallic click. The yellow lantern light spilled across the porch planks, illuminating a man dressed in a tailored wool coat despite the warm night air. Behind him, 2 shadowed riders sat atop dark horses, their hands resting lazily near their holsters. "You're on private land, Voss," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. Harlan Voss offered a slick, unhurried smile. He was a plump, smooth-faced land speculator whose wealth had been built on the ruin of desperate valley farmers. "Just delivering official business from the county seat, Bennett, a notice of tax arrears, $210 due in 30 days. If you can't pay the county auctions, the northern pasture, and I intend to be the highest bidder." He thrust a sealed parchment against the doorframe, turned his horse, and galloped off into the darkness, his riders trailing close behind. Thomas stood frozen on the porch as the dust settled. $210 was a fortune, an impossible sum for a ranch that barely yielded $50 a year in dried beef. His hands trembled against the wooden stock of his rifle. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, retrieved the notice, and brought it inside to the lamplight. Her sharp merchant's mind immediately went to work analyzing every line of black ink. "This is fraud," she declared calmly, laying the paper flat on the table. "Your property assessment was manipulated. The tax rate listed here is double the legal territorial cap for agricultural land. And look at the boundary description. He claims the northern meadow is county wasteland, not part of your original deed." Thomas let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "It doesn't matter what the paper says, Miss Vance. Voss owns the county clerk in Fresno. He's been squeezing dry ranches out here for 5 years. It matters because he isn't squeezing you for dry dirt, Mr. Bennett." Eleanor replied, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "He's squeezing you because he knows what lies beneath that pasture." She pointed a finger toward the northern window. "I spent my youth reviewing geological surveying reports in my father's merchant house in San Francisco. The limestone outcroppings on your northern hill, combined with the deep green mesquite lines, are textbook signs of a massive subterranean river flowing down from the Sierra Nevada mountains. Voss knows it. He wants to seize your land drill for water and sell it to the railroad company at 10 times its value." Thomas stared at her, his gray eyes wide with disbelief. An underground river. On this dust bowl, yes, Eleanor said firmly, and we are going to drill for it before his 30 days are up. The next morning, Eleanor acted with the swift, decisive authority of a seasoned business partner. She did not ask Thomas for permission, nor did she flaunt her wealth. Instead, she sat him down at the kitchen table, opened her iron-bound traveling trunk, and laid 40 crisp $100 banknotes on the oak surface, the full remainder of her dowry. Thomas recoiled as if the paper were hot iron. "I can't take your money, woman. I won't be beholden to a stranger's charity." Eleanor's eyes flashed with spirited fire. "This is not charity, Thomas Bennett. This is an investment in a joint enterprise. I am buying a half share in the Bennett Ranch Water Company. You provide the land and the labor. I provide the capital and the management. If you let your pride stand between your 6 sons and their future, then you are a far weaker man than I took you for." Thomas looked at the money, then at Caleb, who was standing in the doorway with broad, hopeful eyes. He swallowed his pride, his jaw tightening as he reached out and shook Eleanor's hand. "Half shares," he agreed gruffly. By noon, Eleanor had ridden into Fresno town alongside Thomas. Using her financial leverage, she hired a crew of steam-powered well drillers and purchased 2 heavy wagon loads of iron piping. Within 3 days, the peaceful silence of the northern pasture was shattered by the rhythmic, thunderous chug of a steam boiler and the sharp clatter of an iron drill bit pounding into the hard rock earth. For 2 weeks, the drilling continued unabated. The 6 Bennett boys worked alongside the crew with tireless enthusiasm. Caleb and Noah hauled cordwood for the boiler. Ethan and Lucas carried water buckets. Even little Henry and Mason cheered whenever the iron drill sank another foot into the ground. Eleanor managed the supplies, kept the workers fed with rich stews, and kept a meticulous ledger of every dollar spent. As the iron pipe drove 50, 70, then 90 feet into the earth, the dry pasture seemed to hold its breath. On the 20th night, darkness fell under a heavy, overcast sky. The drilling crew had retired to their tents near the dry creek bed. Inside the cabin, Eleanor was going over the daily expense sheets when a sharp smell of wood smoke drifted through the open window. Thomas bolted to his feet, grabbing his rifle. The barn. Eleanor rushed onto the porch. Flames were licking up the dry pine walls of the old wooden barn near the pasture. Through the swirling red smoke, she caught sight of 2 mounted men galloping away carrying lit torches. Harlan Voss had realized the drill was getting close. "Caleb, Noah, get the cattle out," Thomas roared, sprinting toward the blaze. Panic threatened to consume the yard, but Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos like a trumpet call. "Ethan, Lucas, form a bucket line from the stock tank Mason, keep Henry inside the house." While Thomas and the older boys fought the fire and drove the panicked horses to safety, Eleanor grabbed a wet wool blanket and charged toward the steam rig. One of the arsonists had thrown a flaming brand onto the wooden platform of the drilling machine, intent on destroying the expensive engine. Without a moment's hesitation, Eleanor threw her heavy body over the flames, smothering the fire with the damp wool before it could reach the fuel line. Just as Thomas knocked down the burning barn door to free the last calf, a strange noise echoed across the pasture, a deep roaring vibration that seemed to originate from the very bowels of the earth. The ground beneath Eleanor's boots trembled violently. The heavy iron drill rig vibrated, its steel cables humming like harp strings. "Get back," the head driller screamed, scrambling out of the pit. With a deafening roar that sounded like thunder cracking open the sky, the iron pipe erupted. A thick jet of mud shot 60 feet into the night air, followed instantly by a towering, magnificent geyser of crystal-clear, ice-cold mountain water. The column of water smashed against the darkness, raining down in heavy, cool torrents over the scorched pasture, dousing the remaining embers of the burning barn and turning the dry, red dust into a surging stream of life. The 6 boys broke into hysterical, joyful screaming, dancing barefoot in the newly formed river that rushed past their toes. Thomas stood drenched in the downpour, his hands lifted to the sky, laughing, a deep, resonant laugh that his children had never heard before in their lives. Through the cascading curtain of water, Thomas looked at Eleanor. She stood soaking wet, her heavy dark hair plastered to her shoulders, her dress ruined, but her face radiant with triumphs. Thomas walked over, grabbed her by the waist, and swung her around in the cold rain, holding her tight against his chest as the underground river transformed their dry world into an oasis. The roar of the artesian geyser did not fade with the morning sun. It settled into a steady, glorious surge that filled the newly dug irrigation channels framing the northern pasture. By noon, news of the miraculous water strike on the Bennett property had swept through the Fresno Valley like a summer gale. Farmers who had spent years struggling against the drought arrived on horseback and in battered wagons, staring in awed silence at the clear, cold stream transforming red dust into fertile mud. 2 days later, armed with water quality samples, geological reports, and Eleanor's meticulously kept account books, Thomas and Eleanor rode into the Fresno County Courthouse. Judge Hollis, a stern, gray-bearded man known for his unyielding honesty, presided over the hearing. When Harlan Voss's slick attorney attempted to argue that the land belonged to the county due to unpaid taxes, Eleanor stepped forward. She laid the original land deed, the bank receipts of her dowry investment, and the revised certified tax assessment flat upon the oak bench. She coolly outlined the exact mathematical discrepancies and fraudulent interest rates Voss had applied to small landowners across the valley. Judge Hollis reviewed the ledger pages with growing indignation. Within an hour, the court issued an injunction, freezing all of Voss's land claims and ordering a territorial investigation into his predatory practices. Stripped of his leverage and facing charges of fraud and arson, Voss fled the county before the week was out, his empire collapsing into dust. In the 2 years that followed, the Bennett Ranch became the jewel of the Fresno Valley. With the subterranean aquifer providing an endless supply of fresh water, Eleanor's sharp merchant instincts guided the family's expansion. They converted 200 acres into thriving citrus groves and green vineyards, which yielded sweet, heavy harvests that commanded premium prices in the San Francisco markets. Eleanor formed a local agricultural cooperative selling water rights at fair, affordable rates to neighboring families, turning the once barren valley into a prosperous community. As the ranch flourished, so did the people within it. The 6 Bennett boys grew tall, healthy, and confident, their thin frames filled out by wholesome meals and their guarded eyes replaced with easy laughter. Caleb, no longer forced to carry the crushing weight of an adult, flourished under Eleanor's guidance, demonstrating a natural talent for business ledgers and machinery. Noah and Ethan took over the livestock management, while young Lucas Mason and little Henry spent their afternoons studying under the tutelage of a schoolteacher Eleanor hired for the Valley District. One warm autumn afternoon, as the scent of sweet orange blossoms drifted through the open windows of the newly expanded ranch house, a sleek leather packet arrived from San Francisco via the Overland Express. Eleanor sat at her mahogany desk in the sunlit parlor, breaking the red wax seal. The letter was from her father. His dignified, elegant handwriting praised Eleanor's unexpected and remarkable financial triumph in the South. He wrote warmly of how proud the family was of her business savvy and subtly suggested that she transfer a portion of her ranch profits back north to bolster her father's struggling shipping line. Eleanor read the letter carefully from beginning to end. Omniscient reflection would have revealed no anger in her brown eyes, only a profound, liberating clarity. She realized that the approval she had spent her youth desperately chasing from her parents no longer held any power over her value as a human being. She folded the thick parchment, stood up, and walked over to the stone fireplace, gently tossing the letter into the soft red embers. She watched it turn to gray ash, feeling the last lingering ache of her past dissolve into the warm air. She walked out onto the broad wooden wraparound porch, where the evening sun cast a golden glow across the lush green groves. Down near the main irrigation gate, Thomas was kneeling in the dirt, instructing Caleb and Noah on how to adjust the timber sluice valves. Hearing her skirt rustle against the floorboards, Thomas looked up. I was a changed man. The hollow, haunted look in his gray eyes was gone, replaced by deep strength and peaceful contentment. He wiped his hands on his trousers, spoke a few words to the boys, and walked up the porch steps toward her. Reaching into his pocket, Thomas drew out a small velvet-lined box. Inside rested a polished gold band crafted by the finest jeweler in Fresno. He had not bought it with her money. He had earned it from his own share of the autumn harvest. I didn't write that first letter, Eleanor, Thomas said softly, his voice rich with quiet emotion as he took her hand in his broad, calloused palm. And I didn't know enough to ask for you when you stepped off that stagecoach. But every morning since, I thank God for the miracle that brought you to my door. He looked into her eyes with deep, unreserved devotion. Will you marry me, Eleanor Vance, not for a bargain and not to save a ranch, but because I love you with everything I am? Tears of genuine happiness welled in Eleanor's eyes. Yes, Thomas, she whispered, stepping into his arms. Yes. That evening, the grand dining room was filled with warm lamplight, rich aromas of roasted meat, and the joyful chatter of a family whole at last. At the head of the long oak table sat Thomas, with Eleanor beside him, flanked by all 6 boys, Aunt Hattie, and several ranch hands. On the mantelpiece, above the hearth, The portrait of Thomas's late wife, Rebecca, now sat right side up in a polished brass frame, a cherished memory of the past that no longer cast a shadow over the present. Beside it stood a framed photograph of Eleanor and the 6 boys taken on the day the first citrus harvest was shipped north. Little Henry now, 7 and sitting proudly in a high-backed chair pointed toward the end of the table where a solid wooden dining chair stood empty against the wall. Eleanor Henry asked, his voice bright and curious, "Why do we always keep that extra chair by the door when everyone is already here?" Eleanor looked around the table at the glowing faces of the boys who had taken her into their hearts, and then at Thomas, whose warm hand rested over hers. She smiled softly, her voice carrying a quiet grace that echoed through the warm room. Because a house doesn't become a home when the walls go up, Henry. It becomes a home when you notice who is standing out in the cold and you pull up another chair. Outside the cool water of the underground, spring flowed steadily through the dark earth, nurturing the roots of the blooming trees, while inside, under the soft golden light, Eleanor Vance rested in the deep, unwavering knowledge that she was finally truly home.